I want to welcome you. It's my honor, and I'm intensely excited to open this conference on a critically important issue. I think this full room speaks to the huge importance of that. I want to start by thanking out-of-town guests. I know many of you probably got up very early this morning, said to make it from DC. We deeply appreciate it. Maybe you got a nice view of Narragansett Bay flying in to TF Green or something. But I also want to mention I'm excited to see a lot of students and Brown faculty here too. It means a lot to me. We've had a great semester together, but this is a particularly busy time of year, as you know, for students and professors. So I appreciate you all taking the time. It's my honor and really a joy to oversee the China Initiative here at Brown University at the Watson Institute. It's been an exciting year, but I do want to note also that my predecessor, Ed Steinfeld, did a remarkable job in setting up this China Initiative. And we're all benefiting from his great work all the time here and indeed with this conference. I do want to mention to you all that this session is being recorded, this first one, and also live streamed. So welcome to the audience, on the internet, on the YouTube channel. But we will have some mics to help with the questions there. But I do want to say to the rest of you, to those present, that this is the only recorded session in this conference and the only live stream session. So the rest of the conference will be more closed. A decision we made because we thought we could get a more candid discussion there. I'm sure you understand. Well, if I can introduce the topic very briefly, I think it's on all of our minds. It's in the pages of the papers every day. But we are brought together here today, on a very grave topic indeed. Despite the sun shining out there, I almost feel in a mood to roll in some major thunderstorms and some gloomy clouds, which we sometimes have here as well. First and foremost, I would say we're collected here because we're trying to prevent a war. And forgive me for putting such fine a point on it, but that's really what we're here to do. And that is, I think I don't have to outline how important that is to prevent a catastrophe for our country, for the whole world. I'll just hold up the cover of The Economist here just to remind you. This is the latest issue, and it says, the Taiwan test, it's closer than you think. And this is not the first time they've said that, but, and I think in a theme that goes with today, maybe this is a kind of euphemism too, right? A test, doesn't say anything about a war. But we all know if it came to war, what a horrible tragedy it would be. And of course, today we're not just talking about war, but we're also talking about rivalry, and the two issues are closely intertwined. I found it remarkable in the New York Times today. I guess I'm the only one who still reads the paper edition, but on A12 it said the U.S. arms one side, China arms the other. So that was about the India-Pakistan tensions. So if you think rivalry is impacting, South Asia and everywhere in the world, as we'll talk about a lot at this conference, absolutely it is. So I want to quickly thank Ellen White, who's done huge efforts to make this conference a success. We'll thank her again at the end, but I do want to say she had the superb idea of having Michael Brennis lead us off here. Let me grab my edition of his truly incredible book here. And as I just told him, I would like to spend 30 minutes here talking about this, how wonderful the book is, but I think I should let him explain it to you first. But there's so many important parts of this book. I'm really was excited to see him talk about the costs of war, which sort of infuses a lot of what we do at the Watson Institute. And that whole approach is definitely part of this book. But I saw a lot of language that I like in this book. I could go on and on about that, but words like military restraint, which I think has an important meaning for all of us. One of Michael, of course, employs with Van Jackson, I should say, the co-author who couldn't be with us today, but talks a lot about the security dilemma. Of course, that's a key concept for those of us trying to prevent war. And he has a different interpretation of the balance of power. Again, a critical concept for us, but to get it right, as he does in this book. I'm really thrilled to introduce Michael Brenes here, and let's learn about his book. I do want to say one small critique: there's no China in the title, right. There you go. Let me read the title for you: "The Rivalry, Peril: How Great Power Competition Threatens Peace and Weakens Democracy." It is an extraordinary book. It is quite succinct, but still extremely sophisticated, and also eloquent. It's a good read. But here's what I want to tell you. A lot of us are China experts here in the room. You may have never seen this book. Maybe it doesn't have China in the title. You need to read this book, folks. It's a very important book. This book, I think, has the potential to help, turn this ship a little bit, or maybe a lot. So I'm thrilled to have Michael here, and I'm going to set a pattern for our whole conference here and give very short bios, and then I'll quickly yield the floor here. Michael Brenes is the co-director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy and lecturer in history at Yale University, and a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy as well. So join me in thanking Michael for sharing his book with us. And one more thing, I believe there are books that are going to be on sale, and hopefully he'll sign a few, including mine. So thanks, Michael.
Can everyone hear me? Is that good? Okay. Well, thanks, Lyle, for having me. Thank you to the Watts Institute. It's great to see so many friends, colleagues, people who I've seen on Zoom over the years in person. I do regret that my friend and co-author Van Jackson could not be here today. He and I obviously conceived this book together, wrote this book together, and as someone just said, he is my Simon to my Garfunkel. He's the Simon to my Garfunkel. I'm the Garfunkel. I guess I'm the Garfunkel in this scenario. But we are a team, and I'm sorry that he can't be here. But I'll try to be a vehicle conduit for him as much as I can be. If there are parts of the book that you don't like, I wrote those, and Van wrote the ones that you do like. So I'm just going to talk for about it's 12:08 right now. I'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes. I don't want to take up too much time, and there's a lot of people here. And if you have questions or comments or anything that you want to raise about the book or about the topic, I want to make sure that there's ample opportunity for you to weigh in. But as Lyle said, this book was, we conceived of this book in 2022, really 2021. Van and I started exchanging ideas and, as Van would say, kind of mind melded over this problem of rivalry with China and why rivalry with China, in our estimation, was being pursued without understanding why and the long-term consequences of it. And there was this narrative that emerged. It started to emerge around 2015, 2016, or the idea of great power competition and competition with China, which came out of the Pivot to Asia piece that Hillary Clinton did in 2011 in foreign policy. And under the Biden administration, I think kind of transformed, or great power competition was transformed into this thing that was hopefully going to remake American democracy. It was not just competition to roll back China or constrain Chinese power as it was under Trump, which things I'll talk about in a bit, but it was an attempt to rejuvenate the American project, both at home and abroad. And what we see now, I think, is ultimately, I'll talk about the effects of that in a minute, but what we see now, I think, is that rivalry is being pursued for the sake of rivalry. There's a question, I think, of ends and means. I co-direct this grand strategy program at Yale. It's one of the great pleasures of my life to do so. And we talk about ends and means frequently. And I think the ends and means as it relates to China and China rivalry have been confused. And I put up these images to give a sense of like how the confusion materializes, I think, in our discourse. So to the right is you get this sort of Biden administration approach to competition with China. So you have the Jake Sullivan, Kirk Campbell argument about competition without catastrophe, that we can manage competition with China over time. This emerged in 2018, 2019. And it's the idea that competition will occupy our lifetimes potentially, certainly over the next 10 years, as Ambassador to China Nick Burns said. And then below the Nick Burns quote is a quote from Rush Doshi about the fact that the United States, as he sees it, is confronting a China that seeks to displace the United States in the world, or at least seeks to displace the United States as the leading power in the world. And later on in that quote, this is from an interview that Rush did with James Lindsay in 2024. That's CFR, the CFR podcast, I forget the name of it now. But Rush later says that this is a competition that will endure, that we are in a protracted conflict with China that has no end in sight. And these are just books that I found on Amazon that have been published over the past couple of years. And this is mostly from sort of the GOP line of thinking, Republicans, which is we win, they lose. This is a book by Matt Kroening and Dan Negrea. Dmitry Alperovitch, World on the Brink, the idea that the United States is in a long-term competition with China, but that the United States can prevail in that competition. And the fear that China is going to attack the United States, if not the United States, then certainly it's going to attack Taiwan. And the fear over a amphibious invasion of Taiwan means that the United States needs to counter China, overtake its, overtaking is maybe not too strong a word, but constrain its power and make sure that it can't carry out its aggressive impulses and tendencies throughout the world. So this is the idea that we're in a long-term protracted competition with China that will ultimately lead to the United States, I think, winning that competition. But the question is how, why, and what, again, ultimately are the consequences of that? How do you win a competition with China? What does that look like? And if it's enduring and unending, then what does that mean for the consequences for the United States and the world? And this is where Van and I were kind of interested in sort of inserting something into the dialogue. So figuring out why competition and great power competition emerged, thinking about the long-term ends of it, and then also thinking about what's already been done to shape, that is, competition has been done to shape democracy both at home and abroad. And so these are some of the main arguments we have in the book. Ultimately, we think that the United States has pursued China rivalry without understanding the long-term consequences of it. We do not believe that rivalry with China will benefit the world and revive democracy. I think if you want to see evidence of that, you can just look at what's happened in terms of the antagonistic relationship between the United States and China over the past couple of years. And then winning with China doesn't actually mean winning. I think, what are the ends of rivalry? How do we think about them in long-term consequences? And that rivalry, therefore, if we don't understand the consequences of it, which I believe are disastrous, will seek to they will destabilize the world and destabilize American, I think, democracy in the process. So these are the arguments in the book. We start, though, because I'm a historian by training, we start with the history of great power competition. And I'm ultimately a historian of the Cold War. And if you look at the idea of a new Cold War, the emergence of the term the new Cold War, there are obviously, therefore, allusions to the old Cold War. And the idea of a new Cold War and the fact that we're in a long-term, again, competition with China, not the Soviet Union, but with China, this is an idea that emerged during the Trump administration, that we're in a new Cold War with China, that we're in a long-term, again, protracted conflict with China. The memory of the old Cold War, the first Cold War, I think informed that. And I think there are two key lessons here that are, or premises really, that people are operating under as we think about a new Cold War and how it relates to the old Cold War, and why great power competition came to be seen as viable, as the means to sort of understand the state of the world today. And the first lesson, or the idea of the Cold War, the first Cold War, was that we are again in a protracted long-term conflict with a superpower, with a peer rival of the United States. And that conflict ended in the United States declaring victory over that enemy, right? In 1991, Soviet Union collapsed. In 1989, before that, the Berlin Wall fell, leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the United States saw or hoped to see liberal democracy and capitalism flourish throughout the world. These were the premises that I think underlied much of the United States in terms of how it dealt with China in the 1990s into the 2000s. And so this is the lesson that the United States is in, again, a long-term conflict with a rival that will lead to, ultimately, again, we win, they lose. We have to engage all of America's economic, diplomatic, even military tools to win that conflict. So again, we're in an all-out fight for existential fight for survival. And our argument is like, okay, if that's true, then we should think about the lessons of the Cold War that aren't often taught or expressed, I think, in the mainstream discourse as it relates to U.S.-China rivalry. One, that the Cold War was incredibly violent, particularly in Asia. I put up the cover of Paul Thomas Chamberlain's book, The Cold War's Killing Fields, which is about this topic, about the violence that Asia saw during the Cold War in Vietnam, of course, but in Cambodia, other parts of Asia. So we should think about the unexpected consequences that rivalry will engender for the United States and the world, particularly for the global South. Two, also that rivalry with the Soviet Union or the first Cold War was ultimately, yes, it did some good for Americans. You do see some clear benefits for American democracy. You see Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, in particular, responding to the Soviet Union in ways that help them or give them opportunities to further civil rights. The idea that the Soviet Union, when this is true, the Soviet Union was using the color line against the United States to say, how can the United States profess to be a truly global superpower, democratic superpower, if it doesn't allow 10 to 12% of its population to vote, and the Soviet Union taking advantage of that and its propaganda? That was an opportunity that the United States, American presidents used to further civil rights and enact civil rights, or help pursue the Civil Rights Act and other types of legislation that reshape democracy today. That did happen, but also the Cold War, we argue, delayed civil rights reforms. It delayed opportunities for feminism and for things like job guarantees or full employment bills or ultimately projects that seem to be too socialist or communist. The idea that if you thought about social welfare in broad terms and trying to broaden the American welfare state, that was a socialist or communist project. That was often, that was a charge, obviously, as we know, levied at people within the Democratic Party and people on the left, that prevented, I think, more extensive and rapid gains for Americans in terms of domestic front. So if we should think about the lessons of the Cold War while rejecting the logic of the Cold War, as Jake Sullivan and Kirk Campbell have argued in 2019, then we should say, well, the lessons are also ones that are incredibly violent and destructive for the United States and the world. So if we're thinking about China rivalry and Cold War 2.0, the argument I would make, and I think Ben would make too, is that we saw a lot of violence. Maybe, again, it was not purposeful, but it was a consequence of this competition with with the Soviet Union. And I expect to see a lot of unintended, inadvertent violence to be a consequence of this new China rivalry for understanding, again, the long-term consequences of great power competition. So that's sort of blending the historical and the contemporary in ways that I think are quite unique to us. But why did rivalry come back? So that's the lessons of the Cold War and how the Cold War shapes the current competition with China. Why did rivalry come back? We make sort of 3 points about why rivalry came back. One is the idea that the United States, and I already alluded to this, the United States helped to further or influence China's power in the wake of the Cold War. The United States recognized China as a rising economic power. It gave it most favored nation status. China's incorporation into the WTO in the 2000s. We encouraged China's rise. We encouraged an integrated economy, or to China integrate its economy with the world, and certainly the United States. And that ultimately came back to backfire in ways that we now know. So by 2011, 2012, and this is the second point we make, when the war on terror starts to not go so well, when we realize that this at least 10-year campaign against terrorism has been a dead end for many many people in the United States and Americans are not so keen on carrying out 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. They're not so keen on trying to eradicate terrorists from the face of the earth. They're souring on American foreign policy. American foreign policy experts start to see China's rise, and that's when you get the pivot to Asia in 2011 as a result. In 2012, so China's growth combined with the strategic shift in American foreign policy, and combined ultimately with our last point, which is the sense that the United States is in a position where it's seeing how it's relatively in a position of decline, or at least Chinese officials start to see the United States as being in a position of decline. And that starts to scare American foreign policy experts. And this is a type of rhetoric. This rhetoric itself is still coming out of China in terms of the United States. Chinese officials, Chinese people within the PRC are saying the United States is in decline. Now is our opportunity, et cetera. And this starts to concern American foreign policy experts who start to formulate a response to this, and you get rivalry as a result. So 2016, we all know what happens in 2016. Donald Trump is elected president of the United States. Donald Trump surrounds himself with people who believe that we are in a great power competition with China. Some of these people are now back in the Trump administration again, Trump 2.0. Bridge Colby and others, but Nadia Shadlow is also there in 2017. And they formulate this national security strategy document in 2017, arguing that China seeks to displace the United States as the premier world power, and that it ultimately is antithetical to U.S. values and interests. And so what you get is a great power competition that seeks to constrain China at all costs. There really is, if you look at I'm sure many of you have already read it, the National Security Strategy of 2017, there is a sense that we have to pull out all the stops to constrain China. And this creates, I think, in terms of democracy, and this is where Van and I come in again, is sort of creates a rhetoric that is going to backfire in terms of how it's utilized and deployed in domestic terms, where China starts to be seen as an enemy that has global ambitions, seeks to thwart democracy, is antithetical to U.S. values. And the result is that China starts to be seen as kind of a boogeyman. The threat is hyperbolized. It's hyperbolized in ways that I think we've seen are all too familiar in recent years, particularly within the GOP, where Senator Tom Cotton and others have said that China seeks to influence our school curriculums. They want to teach your children how to be communists. And so everything from sort of the daily life of Chinese Communist Party influencing daily life to the idea that China is going to, it's just a matter of when, invade Taiwan and displace the United States from, again, that leading position in the world. And this led to what we see as China bashing, right, or China baiting, where China starts to be seen as an enemy that is, again, not doesn't align with the reality of the threat. And so China becomes a cudgel within the GOP and some Democrats too. I put up, this is Tim Ryan and J.D. Vance from the 2022 Ohio Senate race. Between the two of them, this is where Vance makes his name in politics, of course, is running for the Senate. I mean, before that, of course, he wrote Old Billy Elegy. But the two of them went back and forth about who was more opposed to China, Ryan or Vance. And in the end, Vance emerges the victor, but not again until the damage is done. I think if you look at the rhetoric as it surrounds that campaign towards China, you combine this with COVID in 2020, where anti-Asian hate crimes go up by over 500%. And you combine that with Donald Trump as a figure who has said things like almost every student that comes over to this country from China is a spy. And so what this has done, I think, if you look at China rivalry and great power competition, it's heightened ethno-nationalism. and racism in the United States in ways that I think are cancerous to a body politic, cancerous to a multiracial democracy like the United States, and therefore has poisoned our politics in ways that I think have become all, unfortunately, too influential in recent years if we look at, again, Trump 2.0. President Biden, of course, was not that. He was not that version of great power competition. He did not think about great power competition in the terms that Trump did, and certainly was not trying to rely upon the rhetoric that we saw Trump use in his first term in regards to China and Chinese immigrants, but still kept many of the tenets of great power competition as central to his foreign policy. So China for Biden was an opportunity. And this is, again, where Van and I start to think about what's happening with great power competition and where we start to form the ideas for this book. This book, I should sort of start out by saying this book was first a foreign affairs article in 2022 that was published, I think, under the title, I think it was telling Lila, Great Power Competition is Bad for Democracy. But I think the point is that Biden ultimately thought that China rivalry could revive American democracy. But not only that, it could be a solution to dealing with neoliberalism, which I think to this day, mostly, has been discredited, right? The idea that the market, through the state, can provide benefits for more Americans than the public sector, that private interests, the private sector, can ultimately do public good. I think that was discredited because of COVID and because of sort of the state models of capitalism that China was employing since really the financial crisis of 2008. And I think Jake Sullivan should be given credit for many things in terms of the Biden administration, but certainly given credit for recognizing that this moment was here, that neoliberalism was dead, and that an alternative needed to emerge. And if you look at the original version of what was be a post-neoliberal order under Biden, Build Back Better, I think it was something that we could all say had a lot of ambition and merit, particularly as it relates to domestic, welfare. Things that I, talked about earlier in regards to the first Cold War, where it was hard to get full employment passed. It was hard to get a more sort of expansive rights for women and for minorities until the 1960s. I think you see under Build Back Better things that Lyndon Johnson would be jealous of, right? Maternity leave, universal daycare, childcare, opportunities for jobs for Americans who do not have a college degree, a shift away from the kind of post-industrial Atari Democrat model that emerged within the Democratic Party in the 1980s into something that's much bolder, much bigger. But then Build Back Better ran into Congress. Build Back Better ran into particularly two people, Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, and Kristen Sinema, Democrat from Arizona. I don't know what she is now. Nothing now. But she shifted to be an independent. And the two of them combined, I think, with the GOP and what the GOP was doing under Trump, which was sort of using China in ways that were a cudgel, stymied a lot of the Build Back Better momentum, stymied a lot of the legislation, and put Biden on the defensive, and put, I think, his overall agenda, the BBB agenda, on the defensive. And what happened was, as a result, was a pivot to China as the solution. In our view, China rivalry became the way to get elements of Build Back Better through Congress. If you look at, for instance, the Chips and Science Act, the IRA, and the Infrastructure Act, those are the three main pieces of legislation that basically that is Bidenomics, right? The Infrastructure Act, the IRA, Chips and Science Act. They are designed or at least justified around the idea that these are bulwarks against China's inroads in technology and climate. And the Biden administration, again, to its credit, was focused on climate, was focused on climate change, was trying to do more on that front when obviously Trump had ignored it, if not, again, exacerbated it. Biden had took it on and said, China rivalry is a way to do it. In the end, though, I think the results are two. One, it's too little. The monies that IRA and chips will produce will not put a huge dent in the size of the problem as it relates to climate change. And two, there's a larger problem, I think, of how ultimately domestically the strategy will work, in the sense that what happens is China rivalry was being used to justify domestic gains on the domestic front. And what happened, and we're seeing this now, is that the GOP is saying, well, we don't need those things. We can just take on China. We don't need China to provide jobs. We're just going to doge them. We're just going to cut them, and we got to focus all our priorities on China. And so the idea that we're going to be nimble and flexible, and again, I give credit to Biden for doing that, was ultimately not effective, I think, in many ways. So what does this mean, I think, for Biden in going forward? Well, if great power competition is not going to benefit democracy in historical terms or contemporary terms, if it's not going to rejuvenate our economy, if it's not going to be like a military Keynesianism of the Cold War, we called Bidenomics national security Keynesianism. What we mean by that is this is a much more limited form of trying to use sort of quasi-Keynesian policies to create jobs and create benefits and get Americans, again, sort of further into the 21st century in regards to technology production, things like that. If it's not going to do that, then, okay, where do we go from here? Combine that with, I think, the problem of China rivalry not creating the conditions for peace and global stability. And certainly, from the Chinese perspective, to respond to rivalry in the ways that they have, I think, is quite revealing. And I should say, I'm not a China expert. I'm a historian who finds this fascinating and read a lot about it. But ultimately, I think there are two competing images of China today. One is that it's an embattled rising power that has a series of domestic problems confronting it, and it's destined for decline. That makes it, therefore, in the eyes of people like Hal Brands and Mike Beckley, is still a danger, still a threat, because its instability will lead it to aggression or belligerence, and that's still a threat as relates to Taiwan, as relates to other issues in the South China Sea and in general for the world. The other is that it's going to overtake its domestic problems, or its domestic problems are not going to be significant in ways that inhibit its power or inhibits its global ambitions. This is sort of where Rush Doshi and others and Kirk Campbell are at. And there's ultimately, two things happening. One is China's declining economically, but still growing militarily and technology. And therefore, we're still going to face a China that's aggressive and will seek to, again, displace American power. Underlying this, again, is the assumption that China has global ambitions for dominance, that it seeks hegemony, not in Asia, not in East Asia, not in Asia generally, but globally. And to our analysis, from Ben and I's perspective, that's just simply not true. The evidence doesn't reflect that. I think China wants two things, or we think China wants two things. One is certainly regional influence, and two, economic affluence. Hence the Belt and Road Initiative, right now 10 years in the making, and hence its incursions in the South China Sea and what it's done in terms of military exercises. I think those two things are true. But ultimately, I think the domestic problems that China is facing and are going to face, combined with the domestic problems that the United States is facing and are going to face over the next 4 to 10 years, puts the two countries in a similar position. I don't think they're mirroring each other in terms of their systems. I think there are certainly elements of both. The state capitalism model under China kind of echoes some of the Bidenomics stuff in terms of state capitalism. But I think if this is the path that we're going towards, recognizing that competition is going to further exacerbate problems between the two countries, I think there might be, again, going down the road, maybe not during the Trump administration, but opportunities for detente or some sort of amelioration of tensions as it relates to things between the two countries. And this is where Van and I come in with our book, because it's a diagnosis of the problem. It's an attempt to sort of systematically understand what's happening, but it's also an attempt to offer a solution or a set of solutions to this problem of rivalry. Like, if not rivalry, then what? How do we escape the paradigm of rivalry? And then what's the alternative to it? And we wrote this book, yes, but we also published this piece in Foreign Affairs, which came out the day the book came out in January 28th, 2025, so a few months earlier. And we argue that ultimately the United States, if it wants to see a more better, peaceful world, if it wants to see a more prosperous economy and more robust democracy, we should stop trying to pursue rivalry for the sake of rivalry. And we should stop trying to pursue primacy, therefore, for the sake of rivalry. And I think the two are inextricable. Rivalry and primacy have been bound up with one another, and they're operating under the same premises without understanding, again, the long-term consequences of both. And I think we need to emphasize the opportunities for cooperation as opposed to competition. And this relates to, again, even Taiwan, Jennifer Kavanaugh and Stephen Wertheim's piece. I think I won't recapitulate that piece, but that was a great piece that I think spelled out some things that we would like to see happen. Not keeping Taiwan as the focus or the hinge point in American strategy towards China, and avoid competition for the sake of competition, particularly as it relates to the global South. Because we are increasingly a multipolar world. I don't think we're in a multipolar world yet, but we're certainly in an increasingly economically multipolar world. And the United States is not going to have the same influence that it once did over that world. Certainly in economic terms. You can see Trump trying to do that through the tariffs, which are kind of using them as kind of like sanctions almost. Trying to use tariffs to reinvigorate American power, but it's not going to have the same effects. Multipolarity is our future. And accommodating that, as opposed to resisting it, I think should be the mission of the United States. And China rivalry is a part of that, I think is important. Moving away from protectionist policies, nationalist policies. Van and I make the point in that Foreign Affairs essay a few months ago that we are in an age of nationalism, similar to what Michael Kimmich has said, that we're in an age of nationalism. And to mitigate that age of nationalism, we need a new internationalist vision of what comes next. You can look at elements of that in FDR. You can look at elements of that in like Wilson. Yes, both problematic visions of internationalism, but at least a vision of internationalism nonetheless. And we've lost that. We've lost the political imagination, I think, to come up with something that's more ambitious, that's more strategic, and more, again, cognizant of what the ends are. So that leads me to where we are now. And here, so I know Lyle told me to give a book talk, and I hope I've given a good one, or at least given a book talk. But I also do want to sort of set the stage for the very rich conversations we're going to have throughout the next 2 days in terms of this conference, but hopefully beyond that after this conference is over, things that I think we're, again, preoccupied with, as Lyle has already said in his opening remarks. And so where are we? What moments are we in? What is Trump doing? I said, where does rivalry go from here? Or what on earth is happening? And this is the question I've posed to various people who have come into my orbit, who have invited to campus, to talks, including Rush Doshi, including Eli Ratner, to say, what is happening? What is America's policy towards China? What is the future? And the answer is we don't know. I think there are things we do know. At least we can speculate with clear evidence about in regards to the next 2, 3, 4 years. One is that great power competition is not dead. At least in our view, it's not dead. I think Stacey Goddard obviously had this piece in Foreign Affairs last month, arguing that great power competition is over. That instead, what we're confronting is an era of great power collusion. I highly admire and respect Stacey's work. I think she's wrong. Unfortunately, I think that great power collusion of the type of like 19th century concert of nations is not going to happen. Trump is using tariffs and using elements of his power to compete with China, but also to put China down. That's the goal, I think, of Trump is a we win, they lose kind of person. And he's hoping that China loses and America wins. Great power competition, therefore, in my view, is still alive, and it's just been remade. Obviously, they are great power competition under Biden, where competition will revive American democracy, revive America's purpose. The American project is gone. Like, Trump doesn't care about that. But I think it's still the malleability of great power competition as a framework and as a tool to understand policy, I think is foreign policy is still here. Second, I think is a grand bargain is unlikely. Although what does a grand bargain look like? I don't know. And two, Trump doesn't seem to be kind of a guy who like will go make a grand bargain and then adhere to that grand bargain. He's not that type of person. If anything, he's fickle. He is mercurial. He will shift when he wants to. You see this with the tariffs. You see this with other issues outside of China. I don't think a grand bargain is possible. And I don't think particularly the Chinese want to see a grand bargain. Again, maybe I'm wrong. The Chinese want to see a grand bargain in Trump's terms. The grand bargain ideas and Trump as a deal maker, I just don't think is on the table. Third, I think from the Chinese perspective, they're going to rely upon rivalry to the ends of rivalry as much as they can. Certainly in personalist terms, Xi Jinping needs rivalry. He relies upon rivalry to hold on to his power. The nationalism that rivalry provides, I think, allows him to keep hold over the Chinese state and ultimately allows him to do the things that he's doing on the economic and military front. And so I don't think you're going to see a China that's rejecting rivalry for the sake of rivalry anytime soon. So this is, again, to me, where our future is, which is, again, to Lyle's point, is another thunderstorm, a dark cloud hanging over our heads today. And I don't mean to be a doomsayer, but here we are. To inject some positivity or levity, I do think, again, there are potential for off-ramps. And I don't know if this is going to happen under Trump, but I think this is the generative types of discussions that we will have, hopefully today and over tomorrow, is like, what are the off-ramps? What are the opportunities to rethink the future of U.S.-China relations? Where are the opportunities for cooperation? Where are the opportunities to maneuver outside of rivalry? And where do we go from here? And judging from the titles of the panels, the papers I've seen already in the panels, I think there's a lot of, good intentions and also good ideas that are here at this conference alone. And so I look forward to engaging with you all about them and to hearing more. I will stop there. I've talked too much.
Okay, that's terrific, Michael. Let's see. I think this mic is working.
Sure.
And let's. I think there'll be a lot of questions here. The good news is we get to talk about this really for the next 2 days. But let's make the most of it here. And we're also sharing with our online audience. So let's go right to Kaiser Kuo of the Sinica podcast in the front row.
Hey, thank you. Fantastic talk. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. And I haven't read the book yet. And you had me all the way up till the very end when you said something that really sort of sits wrong with me. And it's this idea that Xi Jinping needs to lean into nationalism and to preserve his hold on power, as though that's tenuous, as though it's somehow precarious, that he suffers this legitimacy deficit, and that if he isn't sufficiently hawkish, he's going to be removed from power. No, that's I think I hear this all the damn time, and it's very wrong.
Yeah.
I hope that you guys reflect on that.
Yeah.
Right of self-criticism.
No. So yes. And I did not mean to imply that. What I think happens, though, is that Xi Jinping uses nationalism as rhetorical tools to project his, to convey certain ideas that he wants to convey to people who he thinks want to hear them. Does that make sense? In the sense that I think he uses nationalism as a rhetorical tool in ways that are part of a larger program to sort of portray certain ideas and convince certain people that certain things are happening as opposed to others. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but
it's still wrong. Okay.
If I can just quickly follow up.
Sure.
Very quick. Okay. Quick. I mean, the peril is, I think there's this phenomenon that's been pointed out, especially by Northwestern University's Isa Ding,
of
she has a great name for it. She calls it authoritarian teleology. This idea that everything that an authoritarian regime or an authoritarian leader does is for the express end of keeping him or herself in power.
Yeah.
And I think we have to resist that. We have to be careful not to fall into that cognitive trap.
Fair enough.
Okay, go to Charlie Glazer.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for your talk. I agree with much of what you had to say about exaggeration, but I don't really see rivalry for rivalry's sake as being the real driver. There are real underlying disputes. And I think that the United States is in a situation where it would have to do much of what it's doing militarily, and I would say some economically, to try and protect the interests it's committed to protecting.
Yeah.
And we can argue about if it's doing it quite the right way or not. But so I think it would be, I'm curious if you could strip away, like, what's the necessary part of rivalry to be distinguished from the extra part of rivalry? And I think given our current commitments that most of it is in the necessary category.
What would you say is necessary in terms of rivalry?
Most basically, we have allies in the region, treaty allies in the region that are increasingly vulnerable to Chinese capabilities. But most critically, we have an ambiguous but nevertheless real commitment to Taiwan, which is increasingly hard to defend and which we actually don't have adequate capabilities to defend. And so I think you have a military issue there, but you also have a deep political issue, which is an issue Taiwan being very, very important to China, and the United States, in many ways, although not absolutely, but in many ways, standing in China's way.
I see. So I don't dispute that the United States and China have clear differences and clear tensions, right? That's not our contention. And the idea that China is not a threat, I think, is not something that we're not engaging with. I do think there's a China threat, multiple threats from China even. But the problem with us, for us, is that these threats are all subsumed under, oh my God, the Chinese seek dominance, right? And again, not just regional dominance or regional influence, but global dominance. And so the response, therefore, to the various types of concerns that you laid out is to go from this is a part of a larger grand strategy to constrain China's long game. And that's the problem for us in terms of rivalry as a framework. And that's rivalry from our perspective, that's rivalry for the sake of rivalry. And not having a sense, and I think this is a larger problem for American foreign policy and American grand strategy, is not having a sense of what our priorities are. Like where is it Taiwan first? Maybe, yes. Right? Is it technology second? Where's climate change fifth, sixth? And where is Gaza within that? Where is Ukraine? Right? What ultimately are we trying to achieve, and what are our ends? Considering again that in our view, primacy is not going to work in the same ways that it did during the Cold War. And so the reaction to those various concerns, I think, is our concern, and we are trying to reorient the conversation around a better grand strategy that would deal with these threats in more reasonable ways.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for your talk. I'm wondering about a lot of what you're describing is, I'm an anthropologist, so
Sure.
This kind of cultural sense of threat inflation is partly what you're tapping into, right?
Yeah.
In this, the view of China. And I'm curious if you've given any thought to the role of media and journalism in particular, any kind of like, what is the stuff that's creating this kind of threat inflation at the level of the everyday individual, for someone in my neighborhood, in my living room saying, I'm actually like scared about this, right?
Yeah. I do think there's obviously a series of bad actors on the media front who are hyperbolizing the China threat to get people scared and to use China as a way, particularly, you saw this during the Biden administration, to use China in a way to get you to go after the Biden administration. The accusations that Hunter Biden was an agent of the CCP, that Biden himself was an agent of the CCP. Who's the guy who made some, what's his face? Dinesh D'Souza, right? Who made laughter ensues. Who made a series of documentaries or actually. You look at YouTube; they're reviewed a lot of times, and I think people believe this stuff, or they're predisposed to believe it because their political biases, and then they reinforces them. There's that stuff, but I think also in terms of just sort of mainstream, if you want to call it, New York Times, Washington Post, there is this sense that we are in a long-term competition with China, and that China is a bad actor that seeks to influence the world in bad ways. In general terms, okay. But then you combine that with some of the rhetoric that comes out of the Biden administration, particularly as it relates to autocracy versus democracy and what that means. And I think people's, if you just poll them on the street saying, is China a threat? They would say, yeah, and China's. So I think there's a sort of the fringe, if you want to call it that, fringe media that is animating some of the base of the Trump wing. And then there's the mainstream media that's sort of buying into the consensus with respectable people, and again, smart, reasonable people who have good intentions for the country, Jake Sullivan, right, Kirk Campbell, and others, buying into that and sort of thinking that that's our future and that's where we have to go. And then the questions about why or how or what are the ends, again, are elided or altogether ignored.
Okay, let's put in the back here. We just have 10 minutes left, so if you make your question kind of succinct.
Yeah, excellent talk. Thank you very much. I have a question. At the end of the last Cold War, one of the most obvious levels of engagement between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was the space. And in fact, not just détente, but it was entente. Like right now, 200 kilometers over our head, a couple of astronauts and cosmonauts are having lunch together still. Okay, so that's an enduring interaction that we can build on in the future with Russia. How about China? Is that an off-ramp to get together with China? And if so, how do we overcome the Wolf Amendment to take advantage of such opportunities?
Yeah, I definitely think that's, space is one, climate change is another, pandemics, like transnational, international issues, right? That, aren't framed in terms of, I don't think you can win a competition for climate change. What does that mean? Or competition for space. What does that mean? Right. There are opportunities there. I don't, again, the questions of sort of where we are now with Trump, I don't see at the moment, and again, this is why these conferences I think exist. I don't see a moment, an opportunity for inroads. But I definitely think in the next, whoever comes after Trump, ideally someone, who is more interested in cooperation on various fronts would take space into account, among other issues like climate change, pandemics, international drug trade, et cetera.
Sorry, Jim. We're short on time.
I'm trying to answer shortly. We can talk afterwards.
I'm Chen Tak. I'm a political theory PhD here. Just want to build on the anthropologist colleagues' question about culture. So I noticed one sharp distinction between the Cold War and this new Cold War is that there seems to be a consensus back then, among the intellectuals to say, well, this is the threat of Soviet Union's totalitarianism. There's a lot of conceptual categories that's being produced at the moment. But now there seems to be very little consensus. Why do you think that's the case?
Consensus on?
Oh, like the key terms to describe what the other side is.
Oh, I think there are a series of terms that are used synonymously, and we all sort of reflexively understand what that means, right? Rivalry and great power competition, I think I've used them interchangeably here. But there are a series of other terms that are applied to China, if I'm understanding your question correctly, that are used synonymously and that sort of are accepted as normative language because of the historical echoes of the Cold War and how we use that language to think about enemies and how we apply that language to the enemy of the Soviet Union and others. Communist states, right? Yeah.
Your time?
Yeah.
Quick. So I actually want to pick up on Stephanie's question and I think it relates to this. What's different, it seems to me, about this Cold War from the old one is when I think about film, the striking difference between the new Top Gun and Strategic Air Command, for example, right, where Paramount went out of its way not to offend the Chinese. And truly, and I think correctly, because they had a market they were trying to sell this in. Whereas the Strategic Air Command, the notion that you would change the insignia on a person's uniform to avoid, offending the Soviets was absurd, right? And so I think that to Lyle's original question, we're trying to stop a war. If you went outside on the street and said, we're trying to stop a war, people would be like, we're trying to stop a war with who? The Iranians? The Houthis? What are you talking about? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yes.
Good. So what we are talking about then is a pretty profound disconnect between elite discourse on, as you showed, we win, they lose, and all that sort of thing, and what the vast majority of Americans care about every single day. And that seems to me plays to our advantage. Right?
Correct.
Yes.
And Biden didn't, or Harris didn't lose because of China. Yeah.
Yeah, David. Yeah.
Michael, thank you so much. I'm also excited about reading the book and really appreciated what you shared, including the better strategy, which I think is a far better strategy, and would love you to keep leaning into that. I was then confused almost about why you were so skeptical about a grand bargain under Trump. I mean, I think it's more likely under Trump than under a Harris administration, because Trump has the sort of Nixon and China ability to do anything. Well, let's hope he doesn't do anything.
Right.
And I think that's part of what we're here to figure out. I mean, I think we sort of going back to what Lyle said and Chris just mentioned, we're here to prevent a war. So we need to push Trump towards some kind of an off-ramp and or grand bargain of some kind.
Yeah. I do think there's something, you're absolutely right. So Trump's transactionalism can be a benefit, right? His, like the line that Richard Nixon used, and I'm paraphrasing, was like, only Republicans could do what he did, open China, right? And I do think there's something to that, that he as a disruptive agent, maybe as an agent of chaos, right? Not in like a Joker sense, but like, agent of chaos. Like he's just going to disrupt things and revise the norms. Is going to, maybe it's like as a Joker, but anyway, but there's an opportunity there, right? And when you're throwing shibboleths out the window, I think there's an opportunity there. My concern is that Trump as a person and the Trump administration is not the Nixon Kissinger dynamic, right? I don't think Trump has a strategic vision. I think Kissinger, for all of his faults, and there were many, had a strategic vision. I don't think Trump is thinking beyond tariffs are great. It's gonna force the Chinese to come to me with hat in hand, asking for all sorts of things, concessions from us, and that'll be great. I don't think he thinks beyond that. I think there are people within the Trump administration who think beyond that, but the question of influence and how much influence they have, to me, is not clear at the moment.
Okay,
He did call for cutting military budgets in half in China, the Russian,
that's not going to happen,
and the nuclear de-escalation talks.
And then back,
All right, lots to talk about. Let's go for the last question, Chaz Freeman.
It's really a comment for you to react to.
Okay.
Looking at Trump from the perspective of Beijing, Tehran, Moscow, Kyiv, he has a perfect record of never keeping his word. So why would you do a deal with him, grand or otherwise? I think this is a fundamental obstacle for the next 3 years to any kind of resolution of this issue. And having said that, I thought your talk was brilliant. But I think we have to be cautious about what is feasible and not feasible.
Yes. Agreed.
All right. Well, on that note, let's thank Michael Bennett.